Austin, Texas, spring 1970. The smell of fried chicken drifted through the packed dining room of Martha's Kitchen, that same golden aroma that had saved 8 lives 25 years earlier. Elise Hartman Crawford stood at the kitchen window, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, watching diners who didn't know they were eating redemption. On the wall behind the register hung a faded photograph. 23 German women and 12 American soldiers, arms around each other, smiling. Enemies who became family. Prisoners who became citizens. All because of what happened in the summer of 1945 in a dusty prisoner of war camp in the heart of Texas, where mercy tasted like buttermilk fried chicken and forgiveness was served on chipped white plates. The lunch rush was in full swing. Families crowded around tables covered with red and white checkered cloths. The sound of silverware against ceramic plates created a rhythm that Elise had grown to love over the decades. A symphony of normalcy, of peace, of second chances earned through years of hard work and the grace of people who had chosen to see her as more than the uniform she once wore. Through the kitchen window, she watched a young couple share a plate of chicken, their daughter perched in a high chair between them, reaching for a piece of cornbread. The mother broke off, a small piece blew on it to cool it, handed it to the child with the unconscious tenderness that mothers have practiced since the beginning of time. Such a simple thing, such an ordinary moment. Yet Elise felt her throat tighten with gratitude that still caught her off guard even after all these years. Because she remembered a time when simple things were not guaranteed, when ordinary moments felt like impossible luxuries, when the smell of fried chicken represented not comfort but confusion, not hospitality but suspicion, not the beginning of a new life but what she had believed would be the last meal before whatever punishment awaited enemy prisoners in a foreign land. Behind her, the kitchen hummed with activity. 3 cooks worked the line, all of them trained in Martha Crawford's methods, all of them carrying on a tradition that had become larger than any single family. The original Martha had passed away in 1962, but her legacy lived on in every piece of perfectly fried chicken, in every conversation about the summer of 1945, in every customer who came not just for the food, but for the story. And what a story it was. One that Elise still struggled to believe sometimes, even though she had lived every moment of it, even though the evidence surrounded her in the restaurant she had built in the community that had embraced her in the photograph on the wall that captured a moment when the impossible became real. But to understand how enemies became family, how fried chicken became an instrument of grace, we need to go back. Back to June 12, 1945. To a transport truck rattling through heat that felt like breathing through wet wool. To 26-year-old Elise Hartman, former signals officer of the Reich, who had just received orders that would change everything she thought she knew about her enemies, about herself, and about the true cost of following orders without question. The truck rattled to a stop outside the wooden gates of Camp Swift, kicking up a cloud of red dust that hung in the thick summer air like a judgment. The dust seemed to linger in ways it shouldn't, suspended in the heat, painting everything in sepia tones that made the world look already faded, already memory, already history being written in real time. Inside the truck bed, 23 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms damp with sweat that had soaked through the fabric hours ago. The uniforms clung to their bodies, uncomfortable and foreign in this oppressive heat that was nothing like the weather they had known in Europe. Even summer in France had never felt like this. This was a different kind of heat, aggressive, relentless, the kind that made breathing itself feel like work. Their faces were masks of exhaustion and a fear they would not name. To name it would be to acknowledge it. To acknowledge it would be to admit that they were terrified of what came next. And these were women who had been trained not to show fear, trained to maintain discipline and composure under any circumstances, trained to represent the Reich with dignity even in defeat. But training could only carry you so far when you had traveled for 6 weeks across the Atlantic in cargo holds that smelled of rust and salt and unwashed bodies. When you had spent days on trains watching a country so vast it seemed to mock everything you had been taught about American weakness. When you had been handed from one set of guards to another like packages being shipped to uncertain destinations, each transfer bringing you further from everything you had ever known. Elise pressed her face against the small window, squinting at the landscape beyond. The glare was intense, even through the dust-covered glass. Everything was brightness and heat, and an openness that felt almost aggressive after the confined spaces of their journey. Endless flat land stretched to the horizon, broken only by scattered oak trees, and the shimmering heat waves rising from the earth like ghosts. The trees themselves looked different from European trees. Twisted, gnarled, adapted to harsh conditions in ways that spoke of survival rather than beauty. In the distance, she could see what looked like cattle, dark shapes moving slowly across the landscape, but they were too far away to be certain. Nothing about this place resembled the rolling hills of Bavaria she had left behind 3 years ago when she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. The Bavaria of her childhood had been green and structured forests that followed the curves of mountains villages that looked like they had grown organically from the landscape over centuries. Order and tradition visible in every stone wall and tended field. And nothing here resembled the France where she had been captured just 2 months earlier as the Reich crumbled around them. France at least had been familiar in its architecture, in its history, and the way human civilization had left its mark on the landscape. Churches and bridges and roads that had existed for hundreds of years, connecting past to present in visible, tangible ways. But this Texas landscape felt primordial, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with human history. The land itself seemed to predate everything indifferent to the wars and borders and ideologies that humans had tried to impose upon it. It had been here long before she was born and would remain long after she was gone, unchanged by her presence or absence. The realization should have been comforting, should have put her own troubles in perspective. Instead, it made Elise feel small and insignificant and utterly lost in a way she had never felt before. She was 26 years old and felt ancient. She was a prisoner in a foreign land and had no idea if she would survive the next 24 hours. She had followed orders for 3 years and had no idea if those orders had made her a soldier or a criminal or something in between that had no name. The truck's back gate swung open with a metallic screech that cut through the heavy afternoon air like a knife. The sound was sharp, final, the kind of sound that marked transitions and endings. The sound of one chapter closing and another beginning, whether you were ready or not. Harsh sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding them after the relative dimness of the truck's interior. Elise raised a hand to shield her eyes, squinting against the brightness that seemed to penetrate straight through her eyelids. The heat that came with the light was physical, almost solid, pressing against her skin like a hot towel. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the brightness, and Elise instinctively straightened her posture, preparing for whatever American cruelty awaited them. She had heard stories about prisoner of war camps, about hard labor in the desert heat, about insufficient food and water used as punishment, about guards who saw prisoners as nothing more than the enemy, less than human, deserving of whatever punishment could be legally administered under the thin veneer of Geneva Convention protections. She had heard these stories from other prisoners during the Atlantic crossing, whispered in the dark cargo holds, shared like warnings or prophecies of what awaited them all. Some of the stories had been specific, names and places and detailed accounts of abuse. Others had been vague, the kind of rumors that grew in the absence of real information, fear filling the spaces where knowledge should have been. Elise didn't know which stories to believe, didn't know if Americans would treat female prisoners differently than male prisoners, or if gender would make no difference when faced with enemies who had killed their sons and brothers. Didn't know if the Geneva Convention was a real protection or just words on paper that would be ignored when convenient. All she knew was that she was about to find out, and that knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone. But the voice that called out to them carried an accent Elise had never heard before, drawling and almost musical in its cadence. The words came slowly, carefully pronounced, with a softness that seemed at odds with military command. The voice of someone who was choosing gentleness, deliberately, consciously, as if it required effort. Y'all step on out now, nice and easy. Ain't nobody going to hurt you here." The words were in English, which Elise spoke only haltingly pieced together from school lessons years ago, and what little she had picked up from American guards during her capture and transport. But the tone was universal. The tone spoke of reassurance, of an attempt to calm fears before they could manifest into panic or resistance. The women climbed down slowly, their legs stiff from the long journey. Hours cramped in the truck bed had left muscles tight and joints aching. Elise felt her knees protest as she straightened, felt the pins and needles of blood flow returning to feet that had gone numb from sitting too long in one position. She counted 6 guards, waiting for them, all men in their 30s and 40s, wearing the uniform of the United States Army. But something about them seemed different from the soldiers she had encountered during her capture in France. Those men had been younger, harder moving, with the efficiency of people who had been at war for years and had learned to function on adrenaline and necessity. These men looked like they had spent more time on horseback than in military formation. Several wore worn cowboy boots beneath their regulation pants, the leather scuffed and shaped to their feet from years of use. One even had a battered hat pushed back on his head, revealing sun-weathered features and kind eyes that seemed wrong, seemed impossible, seemed like a trick. Their uniforms were clean but not pressed to parade ground standards. Their weapons were present but not prominently displayed. They stood at attention but not rigid attention, a kind of relaxed professionalism that suggested they took their duties seriously without treating every moment as a combat situation. It was disorienting. Elise had prepared herself for hostility or indifference. She had not prepared herself for what looked almost like hospitality. The tall guard who had spoken stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal a face carved by wind and sun and something else, something that looked like grief poorly hidden beneath layers of forced composure. He was in his 40s, she guessed, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into bright sunlight. His hair was dark but graying at the temples. His hands, as he gestured while speaking, were large and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with them, who knew the feel of rope and wood and leather. He gestured as he spoke. His movements, economical practice, the movements of a man who worked with his hands and meant what he said. "Name's Wade Crawford. I know most of y'all don't speak much English, but we'll figure it out." Another guard stepped forward, younger perhaps, mid-30s, with dark hair and eyes that held a kind of patient understanding. He spoke in German, his accent heavy, but his grammar mostly correct, the German of someone who had studied it seriously but had limited opportunities to practice with native speakers. He introduced himself as Luis Ramirez and explained that he would be translating when necessary, that the women should feel free to ask questions if they had them, that this was Camp Swift and they would be here until arrangements could be made for their eventual repatriation to Germany, that they would be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, that they had nothing to fear if they followed the rules and caused no trouble. Elise watched Wade Crawford's face as Louise spoke, watched the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when his eyes moved over them, taking in their faces, their postures, the exhaustion visible in every line of their bodies. Watch the way his right hand trembled slightly before he clasped it behind his back, hiding the tremor from view, but not before she had seen it. This man was not calm. This man was struggling with something. The forced smile did not reach his eyes. The gentle words did not match the tension visible in his shoulders. He was performing hospitality while fighting against something inside him that wanted something else entirely. And that made him more frightening than any openly hostile guard could have been, because Elise did not know what he was struggling against, did not know if he was fighting to maintain professionalism against the urge to exact revenge, did not know how long a man could sustain that kind of internal battle before something broke. Wade turned a gesture at the compound behind him, and Elise followed his motion with her eyes. Simple wooden barracks surrounded a dusty yard with a larger building at the center that she assumed was the mess hall. The barracks looked newer than she expected, the wood still showing some of its original color rather than being completely bleached by sun and weather. There were windows, actual glass windows, which suggested these structures were meant for long-term occupation rather than temporary holding. Beyond the immediate compound, she could see other buildings. Administrative structures, perhaps. Storage. What might be guard quarters. And beyond that more open land stretching to the horizon, the flatness broken only by those twisted oak trees and the occasional mesquite that Luis had pointed out during the drive. The whole setup looked more like a small military base than a prison camp. There were fences, yes, but they didn't look particularly formidable. There were guard towers, but they seemed to be unmanned at the moment. The overall impression was of a place designed to contain people who were not considered dangerous people, who were expected to accept their captivity without requiring excessive security measures. "This here's going to be your home for a while," Wade said, and Luis translated. "It ain't the Ritz, but it's clean and it's safe. You'll be treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Fair rations, medical care, work assignments that won't break you. We follow the rules here." Elise glanced at her fellow prisoners. Confusion flickered across their faces. The same confusion she felt herself. Where was the hostility they had prepared for? Where were the harsh commands and threatening postures? Where was the punishment they had been told awaited prisoners of war? Clara Becker, the former nurse who had been on the transport with them, whispered in German, "Where is the hostility? Where are the harsh commands? This does not feel right. It feels like a trap." "Maybe it is a trap," another voice responded. "Maybe they are being kind now to make us lower our guard." Then the real treatment begins. But Elise didn't think so. The tension in Wade Crawford's body, the tremor in his hand, the grief barely hidden behind his careful smile, those were not the signs of someone setting a trap. Those were the signs of someone fighting an internal battle, someone choosing to be kind despite every instinct telling him to do otherwise, which meant this kindness was real, which meant it was costing him something, which meant whatever happened next would depend on whether his better nature could sustain the fight against whatever darkness he was holding at bay. Wade Crawford smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. The smile looked like something he had practiced in a mirror, something he was forcing his face to do while his heart pulled in the opposite direction. The muscles around his mouth moved correctly, creating the shape of warmth and welcome. But his eyes remained hard distant, focused on something the women could not see. Then he called out something that would change everything, his voice carrying across the dusty yard with a forced cheerfulness that felt like effort made audible. "Y'all Nazi gals hungry? We got supper waiting." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of reaction spreading across the assembled women. Some tensed at the word Nazi, a label they had worn with pride 3 years ago, and now carried like a brand they could not remove. Others focused on the word hungry, their bodies responding to the suggestion of food with involuntary reactions. Mouths watering, stomachs clenching, because they were hungry, desperately, bone-achingly hungry in ways that went beyond the physical. Hungry for normalcy, for kindness, for some indication that they were still human beings, worthy of basic dignity, rather than enemies to be punished for crimes they had committed while following orders they had been taught never to question. 3 months earlier, Elise had been stationed at a communications facility outside Lyon, France, monitoring radio transmissions and decoding messages for Wehrmacht officers who grew more desperate with each passing day. The facility had been underground, carved into the hillside, cool and dark, and filled with the constant hum of radio equipment and the clatter of typewriters transcribing coded messages. She had joined the auxiliary in 1942 on a cold January morning when the recruitment posters had made service look like adventure and duty and the chance to be part of something larger than herself. 19 years old and full of conviction that she was defending her homeland against enemies who threatened everything she knew. Her father, a schoolteacher in Munich, had been cautiously supportive, his academic nature making him question some of the Reich's methods, even as he accepted the necessity of defending German sovereignty. Her mother had cried but understood that young women across Germany were being called to serve in whatever capacity they could. Better the auxiliary than the factories. better communications work than nursing near the front lines where Russian artillery could reach, better alive and useful than sitting at home waiting for news that might never come. Elise had been assigned to communications because of her quick mind and steady hands. She had always been good with puzzles, with patterns, with seeing connections others missed. In school, she had excelled at mathematics and languages, the kind of abstract thinking that translated well to code breaking and signal analysis. She had spent long hours in those windowless rooms wearing headphones that pressed against her ears until they ached, transcribing coded messages that she was forbidden to question or discuss. Coordinates for artillery strikes, troop movements, defensive positions along the French coast, supply line information, intelligence about Allied movements gathered from various sources and compiled into reports that went up the chain of command to people who made decisions about where to send men and weapons. She decoded them all with mechanical precision, her fingers flying across the typewriter keys, transferring the jumble of numbers and letters into coherent German text that made sense of chaos. She never allowed herself to think about what those numbers meant in terms of human lives. Never let herself imagine the men who would die because she had been efficient at her job. That way lay madness. That way lay the kind of moral paralysis that would make it impossible to function. So she had compartmentalized, had told herself she was just doing her job, just following orders, just one small cog in a vast machine whose overall purpose was beyond her responsibility or control. It was what they all told themselves. It was how any of them managed to sleep at night. But by March of 1945, there was nothing left to defend. The careful compartmentalization began to crack as the situation became increasingly desperate. Allied forces had swept through France with overwhelming power, their advance so fast that maps became outdated by the time they were printed. The communications facility received orders to evacuate, then to surrender, then no orders at all, as command structure dissolved into chaos. Officers who had maintained rigid discipline for years suddenly disappeared in the night, taking whatever supplies they could carry. Documents were burned in oil drums outside the facility, the smoke visible for miles a signal to anyone watching that the end was coming. Radio traffic became sporadic, then desperate, then silent. Elise and 22 other women from various auxiliary units had been captured together by American forces near the Swiss border on a rainy April morning. They had been waiting for transport that never came, huddled in an abandoned barn, when American soldiers surrounded the building and called for their surrender in accented but functional German. The capture itself had been anticlimactic. No shots fired, no violence, just exhausted women raising their hands and walking out into the rain to face young American soldiers who looked almost as tired as they felt. Some of the soldiers had seemed disappointed that the prisoners were women. Others had seemed relieved. All of them had treated the capture as routine, one more task to complete in a war that was clearly winding down. They were processed through a temporary holding facility, a former school where they slept on thin mattresses, in classrooms that still had alphabet letters posted on the walls. Then they were designated for transport to the United States, to camps far from the fighting, far from everything they had ever known, far from whatever fate awaited prisoners who remained in occupied Europe. The journey across the Atlantic had been long and frightening in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. The women were kept separate from male prisoners housed in converted cargo holds with basic sanitation and minimal rations. The crossing had taken 2 weeks, the ship rolling constantly in ways that left some women sick and others unable to eat. They weren't mistreated, but they weren't shown kindness either. They were simply cargo being shipped to an uncertain destination, moved from one holding area to another with the impersonal efficiency of logistics. Guards who spoke no German, food that was adequate but unfamiliar. Days that blurred together into a monotonous routine of waiting and worrying and trying not to think about what came next. Elise had spent those weeks at sea contemplating what awaited them. Would they be put to hard labor in the desert? Would they face revenge from Americans who had lost sons and brothers and fathers to German bullets? Would they be held for years, decades, even as political prisoners, caught in whatever Cold War tensions might emerge from this hot war's ashes? The not knowing had been worse than any specific fear. The imagination could conjure horrors far worse than reality usually provided. And trapped in that cargo hold with 22 other women who were all spinning their own nightmare scenarios, there was no escaping the spiral of anxiety and speculation. When they finally reached American soil, the sheer scale of the country had overwhelmed them. The train journey from the East Coast to Texas had taken days, passing through landscapes that seemed impossibly diverse and abundant. Cities that showed no signs of bombing, damaged their buildings intact, and lit at night as if energy was unlimited. Farmland stretching endlessly in every direction, crops growing in organized rows that spoke of mechanized agriculture on a scale impossible in war-torn Europe. People who looked well-fed and confident, going about their lives as if war was something happening somewhere else entirely, something that did not touch them, did not leave craters in their streets, or hunger in their children's eyes, or grief in their morning coffee. Women in dresses that looked new, not mended and remade from older garments. Children who ran and played without the haunted look of those who had seen too much. Men who walked without the visible wounds that marked every German city. Elise had pressed her face to the train window, watching this strange country roll past, feeling her understanding of the world crack and reform with each passing mile. The propaganda had told them America was weak, decadent, unable to match German discipline and industrial might. The propaganda had been wrong about so many things it made her head spin to catalog them all. Germany was in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns that had lasted years. Its people starving and scattered, fighting over scraps in the streets of what had once been proud metropolises. Its industry destroyed its infrastructure, shattered its future, a blank slate that would be written by the victors. Yet here was America, untouched and thriving, so vast that the war seemed to have left no mark upon it. Their cities intact, their people healthy, their economy running at full capacity, producing not just weapons, but consumer goods, luxuries, things that served no purpose beyond making life more comfortable. The propaganda she had been taught suddenly felt thin and transparent, a lie told by desperate men to a population that wanted desperately to believe. A lie she had swallowed whole because questioning it would have meant questioning everything. And questioning everything would have made it impossible to function in a world that demanded obedience and conformity and the suspension of individual judgment. Now standing in the dust of a Texas prisoner of war camp, those questions could no longer be avoided. What had she been fighting for? What had all those decoded messages accomplished beyond hastening the deaths of men on both sides? What did duty mean when the cause itself had been built on lies? The mess hall smelled like nothing Elise had ever encountered. Rich, savory, with an underlying sweetness that made her stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. The scent hit her like a physical force as she stepped through the doorway, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. The 23 women filed in slowly, uncertain and wary, their eyes adjusting to the dim interior after the brutal brightness outside. Long wooden tables stretched before them, simple but clean, the wood worn smooth from use. At the far end, steam rose from large metal serving trays, and the smell intensified with each step closer. Wade Crawford stood near the food, that same careful smile on his sun-carved face. Another guard stood beside him, the younger man with dark hair and eyes that held understanding. Luis Ramirez, the translator, the bridge between languages and perhaps between enemies. Luis spoke slowly in accented German, his voice carrying across the quiet hall. Sergeant Crawford says he knows you probably had rough travel rations these past weeks, so he and the other guards figured they'd start things off right. This here's a Texas welcome. Wade lifted the lid off the first tray with a practiced motion, and Elise's breath caught in her throat. Golden brown chicken pieces glistening with oil piled high and still crackling faintly from the heat. The smell intensified, filling the hall with an aroma that made her mouth water despite her confusion and fear. Beside the chicken sat bowls of what looked like mashed potatoes, their surface smooth and inviting, dark beans that smelled of smoke and spices, and golden squares of something she didn't recognize, their tops browned and slightly crispy. Luis continued translating then as Wade spoke. That's cornbread, and these are pinto beans. Real Texas eating right here. Y'all come on and get yourselves a plate. Don't be shy now. The women exchanged glances, and Elise could see the same questions reflected in their faces that echoed in her own mind. Was this a trick, some kind of test to see how they would react to kindness? Would accepting this food be seen as weakness, as capitulation, as forgetting who they were and where they came from? In the holding facilities during their journey, they'd received adequate but bland food. Rice that tasted of nothing. Thin soup with vegetables that had been cooked until they lost all texture. Hard bread that required strong teeth to chew. Portions calculated to keep them alive and functional, but nothing more. Food as fuel, nothing more, nothing less. This was different. This was food prepared with care, with attention to flavor and presentation. This was food meant to be enjoyed rather than merely consumed. This looked like something you would serve to guests, not to prisoners, not to enemies, not to people whose country had killed your sons and brothers. One woman stepped forward, first breaking the paralysis of indecision. Clara Becker, thin and blonde, who had served as a nurse and carried herself with practical confidence even in captivity. She approached the serving line with her chin up, defiant, refusing to show fear, even as her hands trembled slightly when she reached for a plate. Wade and Louise served her personally, and that itself was strange. Officers serving enlisted personnel, guards serving prisoners. The whole dynamic was inverted from what military hierarchy demanded. Wade piled her plate high with food, generous portions of everything, more food than she could comfortably eat in one sitting. Clara accepted her plate with trembling hands, murmuring her thanks in German, before catching herself, remembering that thanking her captors might be seen as weakness by the other women watching. But the chicken was still hot enough that she had to be careful picking it up, the heat radiating through the crispy coating. She took a tentative bite and Elise watched her expression transform, eyes widening in shock, jaw slowing as she chewed more deliberately, tasting rather than just consuming. Around Clara, the other women were approaching the line now. Hunger overcoming suspicion, need overcoming pride, the basic human response to food after deprivation, winning out over political and ideological considerations. Elise waited until last, watching the reactions of the others as they received their food and found places at the long tables. Watching them eat with expressions that shifted from wariness to shock to something that looked dangerously like gratitude. Watching Wade Crawford's face as he served each woman, his forced smile never quite reaching his eyes, his hands steady despite the tremor she had seen earlier. When she finally approached the serving line, Wade Crawford looked at her directly for the first time. Their eyes met across the steam rising from the food. His were hazel time, marked at the corners, with lines that spoke of years spent in bright sun and open spaces. Eyes that held a pain he was working very hard to hide behind layers of forced hospitality. He served her plate himself, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he used the serving utensils. Piled it with chicken and potatoes and beans and cornbread portions as generous as what he had given the others. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and she felt the warmth of his skin, the tremor running through him despite his controlled expression. She murmured thanks in German, then caught herself and tried in English. "Thank you." His expression flickered for just a moment, something unreadable crossing his face before the careful mask returned. "You're welcome, ma'am." Elise carried her plate to the table and sat beside Clara, setting it down carefully, staring at the food that seemed almost obscene in its abundance. She picked up a piece of chicken, feeling the heat through the crispy coating, bringing it to her mouth. The crispy coating shattered between her teeth with an audible crunch, giving way to tender, juicy meat, seasoned with flavors she couldn't identify, but that seemed to explode on her tongue. Salt and pepper, yet, but something else, something with a slight heat to it, something that made the chicken taste like more than just chicken, like care had been taken, like someone had wanted this to be good. It was nothing like the bland, overcooked food she'd grown accustomed to during the war years in Germany, when everything had been rationed and stretched thin, when meat was a rare luxury, and every meal was calculated to provide minimum nutrition with maximum efficiency. This was food as pleasure, food as comfort, food as an expression of hospitality and perhaps humanity. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions, and Elise felt herself relax slightly, knowing her own response wasn't unique. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite as if trying to make the meal last forever, knowing that such abundance might not come again. Others devoured their food with the desperate hunger of people who had been uncertain where their next meal would come from, who had learned not to waste anything, who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly full rather than just no longer empty. A few began to cry quietly, and this Elise understood too. Not loud dramatic sobs that would draw attention, but silent tears that streaked through the dust, still clinging to their faces, tears that came from being overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness that contradicted everything that had been taught about their captors. About Americans who were supposed to be brutal and vindictive, who were supposed to treat prisoners like animals, who were supposed to make them suffer for the crime of having been on the losing side. About enemies who showed no mercy because mercy was weakness and weakness led to defeat. One woman refused to eat, and Elise noticed this too. Ingrid Vogel, 21 years old, the youngest among them, sat with her arms crossed over her chest, staring at her full plate with an expression of stubborn resistance that bordered on fury. "This is manipulation," Ingrid hissed in German, her voice low but carrying in the quiet hall. "They're trying to make us weak, make us forget who we are. My brother died fighting these people. He died at Normandy, killed by American bullets. And they want me to sit here and eat their food and smile and forget I will not dishonor his memory by accepting their charity." But even as she spoke, Elise noticed Ingrid's eyes kept drifting to the chicken on her plate. Noticed the way she swallowed hard, fighting against hunger that had been her constant companion for months. Noticed the internal battle playing out on her young face, ideology, warring with basic human need. From the corner of the mess hall, Wade Crawford watched them eat, his arms crossed, but his expression measured and controlled. Luis Ramirez stood beside him, and Elise could hear them speaking quietly in English, though she couldn't make out the words over the sounds of eating and the low conversations happening at the tables. Luis's voice was barely audible but warm with approval. "Ain't nothing breaks down walls quite like good food. Your mama taught you right, Wade." Wade nodded, but Elise could see the tension in his body, could see his jaw clenched so tight that a muscle jumped near his ear. His eyes moved over the women as they ate, and for just a moment his careful mask slipped. Elise saw something raw and terrible flash across his face. Grief, rage, pain that looked like it went soul deep, carved into him by loss so profound it had changed the fundamental shape of who he was. Then it was gone, hidden again behind professional courtesy and forced hospitality, but Elise had seen it, had seen the truth beneath the kindness. And seeing it made her more afraid than any open hostility could have, because she understood now that this man was not being kind, because kindness came easily to him. He was being kind despite something inside him that wanted the opposite. He was choosing mercy while fighting against something darker, something that demanded revenge or justice or whatever you called it when grief turned into action. And Elise did not know how long a man could sustain that kind of fight before something broke. That night in the barracks, Elise lay awake on her narrow cot, staring at the wooden ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The ceiling was rough pine, the boards not quite flush with each other, gaps visible where they met. Through those gaps, she could hear the sounds of the Texas night, insects singing, something that might have been an owl, the distant lowing of cattle carried on the hot wind. Around her, the other women shifted restlessly in their beds, equally unable to sleep despite their exhaustion. The cots were metal frame with thin mattresses, more comfortable than the ship's cargo hold, or the train benches, but still institutional, still temporary, still marking them as prisoners rather than guests despite the fried chicken. The Texas heat pressed down on them even after sunset, thick and heavy, in a way that made breathing feel like work. The air itself seemed to have substance, moisture, and warmth, combining into something you could almost touch. So different from the dry continental climate of Munich, or even the more temperate zones of France. Elise could hear the other women breathing, some sleeping, despite the heat, others lying awake with their own thoughts. The barracks smelled of wood and dust, and 23 women who had been traveling for weeks without adequate bathing facilities. Not unpleasant exactly, but intimate, human. The smell of people living in close quarters. "They're trying to confuse us," Clara whispered from the next bunk, her voice cutting through the darkness. "Make us weak with kindness, so we'll tell them things." What things? Frida Adler responded, her voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who had stopped caring about strategic thinking. "The war is over. Germany has surrendered. What secrets do they think we know that matter anymore?" Elise rolled onto her side, the cot creaking beneath her weight. That chicken had been real, prepared with care and served with what seemed like genuine hospitality. Not the calculated hospitality of intelligence gathering, but something more complicated. Something that suggested these Americans didn't quite know what to do with female German prisoners and had defaulted to the kind of treatment they would offer any stranger in need. But accepting that truth meant accepting something even more difficult. It meant admitting that the Americans weren't the brutal monsters she'd been told about, which meant questioning what else she'd been told that might be lies. And if she started pulling at that thread, where would it end? What would be left of her understanding of the past 3 years if she admitted that the cause itself had been built on deception? "My brother died fighting Americans," said a quiet voice from across the room. Ingrid's voice rough with suppressed emotion and something that might have been tears. "In Normandy. They killed him. The telegram came last year. He was 19. How can we accept kindness from people who killed our brothers, our fathers, our friends?" The words hung in the darkness like an accusation, and Elise knew there was no good answer. Because Ingrid was right. The men who had fed them tonight belonged to the same army that had killed German soldiers. Perhaps not the same units, perhaps not the same battles, but the same side of a war that had turned brothers and fathers and sons into corpses and memories. Elise thought about Klaus, her baby brother, 20 years old and conscripted into service in the war's final desperate months when Germany was throwing children and old men into battle because there was no one else left. She hadn't heard from him in 3 months, didn't know if he was alive or dead fighting, or captured somewhere in the chaos of occupied Germany, or buried in an unmarked grave. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. Better to know the worst than to live in the uncertainty. Better to grieve a confirmed death than to carry hope that might be delusion. "The Americans I shot at probably had sisters too," Elise heard herself saying, surprising herself with the admission. The words came out before she could stop them, before she could calculate whether saying them would make her look weak or disloyal or too sympathetic to the enemy. She had never fired a weapon, but she had decoded messages that sent men to their deaths. She had been part of the machine that fed soldiers into the grinding violence of war. She had sat in climate-controlled rooms wearing headphones while men died because of the coordinates she transcribed. The distance didn't absolve her. If anything, it made it worse. She had participated in killing without having to face the human cost directly. "Don't," Clara said sharply from the next bunk. "Don't make them human. It's easier if we remember they're the enemy." But Elise couldn't unknow what she'd experienced that evening. Wade Crawford's wind-etched face creased with concern he was trying to hide. Luis Ramirez's careful efforts to explain each dish, wanting them to understand and enjoy their food rather than just consume it. The way none of the guards had shown hatred or cruelty, only a kind of practical hospitality that seemed as natural to them as breathing. She thought about the Germany she left behind, the one where food had become scarce and people had grown gray with hunger and fear, where women her mother's age had traded family heirlooms for bread, where children with swollen bellies from malnutrition played in rubble that had once been homes and schools and churches. She thought about the communications facility where she'd worked, where officers had become increasingly frantic and desperate as defeat closed in, where the professional discipline that had defined the Wehrmacht for years had gradually eroded into every man for himself, where documents were burned and supplies hoarded and officers disappeared in the night, abandoning their posts and their subordinates to whatever fate awaited them. She thought about the propaganda posters she'd seen throughout the war, depicting Americans as cruel aggressors who wanted to destroy German culture and enslave German people, who were motivated by greed and Jewish conspiracy and hatred of everything noble and pure, who would show no mercy to prisoners because mercy was a weakness that democracy bred. Then she thought about that fried chicken cooked with care by men who could have simply thrown rations at them and walked away. Men who had served them personally guard serving prisoners, inverting the hierarchy because somehow that seemed like the right thing to do. Small kindnesses that cost them nothing but meant everything to women who had expected punishment and received grace instead. "I don't think it's easier," Elise whispered into the darkness. "I think it's harder. But maybe it's also true." Silence met her words, the kind of silence that meant others were thinking, processing, wrestling with the same contradictions. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless song. Inside, 23 women lay awake in the Texas heat trying to figure out who they were if they were no longer who they had been. The next morning, June 13th, dawned hot and cloudless. Elise woke early, unable to sleep past dawn despite her exhaustion. The barracks had no curtains, and the early sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold that would soon give way to the harsh white light of full day. She lay in her bunk, listening to the sounds of the camp coming to life around her. Boots on wooden floors, the rhythm suggesting guards changing shifts or beginning morning routines. Voices calling to each other in that drawling accent that still sounded foreign to her ears, the words themselves indistinct, but the tone suggesting casual camaraderie rather than military formality. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed incongruous and almost comforting in its normality. The sound reminded her of Bavaria, of summer mornings on her uncle's farm, where she had spent childhood vacations. Before the war, before everything changed, when the world had seemed stable and comprehensible and aligned with what she had been taught was right and true. At morning assembly, Wade Crawford introduced them to their daily routines. The women stood in loose formation in the dusty yard, the heat already building despite the early hour. Work assignments were announced, meal times established, recreation periods defined, everything outlined clearly and professionally, following Geneva Convention protocols to the letter. The women would maintain the barracks, keeping them clean and organized. Some would work in the laundry, washing uniforms and linens for the entire camp. Others would help in administrative offices, filing and organizing under supervision. Light duty, nothing that could be considered forced labor, nothing that would break them physically or spiritually. It was all very civilized, all very correct, all very confusing for women who had been prepared for something much harsher. But as Wade spoke, Elise noticed his attention kept drifting to the camp entrance, his eyes returning again and again to the road beyond the gates. He was waiting for something, someone, and whatever he was waiting for, it made him tense in ways the assembled prisoners did not. When a jeep pulled up outside the gates, his entire body went rigid. The change was visible, dramatic, the relaxed professionalism replaced instantly by something harder and more guarded. A new officer climbed out of the jeep, and even from a distance, Elise could see he was different from the guards she had met so far. Lean, late 30s, with intelligent eyes that moved over everything with cold precision. A purple heart medal visible on his uniform. He walked with a slight limp favoring his left leg, the gait of someone who had been wounded and recovered but never quite returned to full strength. When he approached Wade, the two men shook hands with professional courtesy, but Elise could sense the sudden shift in atmosphere, could feel Wade's carefully maintained calm fracture, just slightly, the mask slipping enough to reveal the strain beneath. The new officer's name was Lieutenant Robert Kane. Elise heard him introduce himself to Wade, heard him say he had been transferred from Camp Huntsville, heard him mention almost casually that he'd heard this camp had the Lady Germans and found it an interesting assignment. The way he said interesting suggested layers of meaning implications that hung in the air unspoken but understood. Wade's response was too controlled, too careful. Words chosen deliberately to reveal nothing of what he was really thinking. Yes, sir. Interesting is one word for it. Lieutenant Kane smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held no warmth, just assessment, calculation. The smile of a man who had come here with a purpose and would not be deterred from it, a man who knew exactly what he wanted and had the patience to wait for the right moment to take it. From across the yard, Elise watched this exchange with growing unease. She didn't speak English well enough to understand in all their words, but she understood body language, understood tension, understood the way Wade's shoulders tightened and Kane's eyes narrowed slightly, two men circling each other with professional courtesy that barely masked something more primal. And she understood that this new officer represented a threat that Wade Crawford, for all his internal struggles, did not. Wade was fighting against his own darkness to choose mercy. But this Lieutenant Kane looked like someone who had made different choices, someone who had let darkness win, someone who had come to Camp Swift with a mission, and that mission had nothing to do with following Geneva Convention protocols or showing kindness to enemy prisoners. The real test, Elise realized, was just beginning. Sunday morning arrived 5 days after the women had first tasted Wade Crawford's hospitality. June 17th, 1945. The heat was already climbing past 90 degrees by 8 o'clock, the sun rising over the flat Texas landscape with the relentless intensity of a forge being stoked. The air shimmered above the dusty ground, creating mirages that made the horizon seem to waver and dance. In the barracks, Elise woke to the sound of an engine approaching. Not the military vehicles she had grown accustomed to over the past days, but something older, rougher, with a distinctive rattle that spoke of years of hard use and careful maintenance. She rolled off her cot and moved to the window, joining several other women who were already watching. An old Ford pickup truck came through the gates of Camp Swift, moving slowly over the rutted road, bouncing on springs that had seen better days. In the driver's seat sat a woman whose silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her weathered hands gripping the wheel with the confidence of someone who had been driving farm vehicles since before most of the guards were born. Martha Crawford, Wade's mother. Elise had heard the guards mention her in passing over the previous day, speaking of her with a mixture of affection and wary respect that suggested she was a force to be reckoned with despite her age. 3 other women from the Bastrop Baptist Church sat beside her in the truck bed, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and determination. They wore simple cotton dresses in patterns that reminded Elise of curtains, practical garments, designed for work rather than fashion. Their hands, like Martha's, showed the marks of years spent doing physical labor. These were not society ladies coming to gawk at exotic prisoners. These were working women coming with a purpose. The truck bed was loaded with supplies. Bags of flour stacked carefully against the cab. Large containers that might hold buttermilk or lard. Kitchen implements wrapped in cloth. Invisible, even from a distance, a cast iron skillet, so old and well-seasoned, its surface gleamed black as a polished stone catching the morning sunlight in ways that suggested decades of careful use and maintenance. Clara appeared beside Elise at the window, her nurse's training making her an early riser even in captivity. "What do you think they want?" Elise shook her head, watching as Wade emerged from the guard quarters and approached the truck. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved with reluctance, as if approaching something he had tried to prevent but failed. Martha climbed down from the truck with surprising agility for a woman of 72, her movements practiced and efficient. She said something to Wade that Elise couldn't hear, but the body language was clear. This was a mother speaking to her son, and whatever she was saying, it was not a request. It was a statement of intent. Wade's shoulders sagged in what looked like resignation. He gestured toward the camp. Building spoke briefly with Martha, then turned and walked toward the barracks where the women were housed. Within 20 minutes, Elise found herself being escorted to the camp kitchen along with 7 other women. Wade had selected them based on their expressed interest in food preparation during mealtimes, their willingness to learn, their demonstrated cooperation over the past 5 days. Elise wasn't sure why she had been chosen, but she suspected it had something to do with the way she had thanked him in English after that first meal, the small effort to bridge the language gap, perhaps suggesting she was open to connection. The camp kitchen was larger than she expected, designed to prepare meals for hundreds of prisoners and guards. Industrial-sized stoves lined one wall, sinks deep enough to wash large pots, counter space that stretched for yards. But in one corner, someone had set up a smaller work area with a domestic-scale cast-iron stove and a wooden table that looked like it had been brought from someone's home. Martha Crawford stood beside that table, her hands already working to unpack the supplies her church friends had brought. She moved with the economy of motion that came from decades of performing the same tasks, no wasted movement, everything purposeful and efficient. Luis Ramirez was there to translate, standing respectfully to one side. And Wade stood near the door, his expression unreadable, his presence suggesting he was there to supervise, but his body language suggesting he wished he were anywhere else. The women gathered in the camp kitchen with expressions ranging from eager to suspicious. Some, like Clara, seemed genuinely interested in learning a new skill. Others, like a young woman named Frida Adler, who had been a radio operator, appeared more curious about these American women than about cooking. And one woman predictably wore an expression of stubborn resistance. Ingrid Vogel stood at the back of the group, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw set in the same expression of defiance she had worn at that first meal when she had refused to eat. She had eventually eaten, of course. Hunger had won that battle, but she had not stopped resisting, in other ways, small acts of defiance that never quite crossed the line into insubordination, but made her position clear. Elise stood near the middle of the group, her hands clasped in front of her, watching as Martha Crawford turned to face them. The old woman's eyes moved over each of them in turn, measuring, seeing something that made her nod to herself before she spoke. Martha's voice was strong, despite her age, carrying clearly in the large kitchen. Luis translated as she addressed them, his Spanish-accented German, managing to capture some of the warmth in her tone. Now listen here, this recipe came from my grandmother who learned it from her mother. It's been feeding Crawford family gatherings since before Texas was even a state. Since before this land was anything but wilderness and cattle, and people stubborn enough to make a life where others saw only hardship. I don't share it with just anybody. She paused, her sharp eyes moving from face to face, and Elise felt the weight of that gaze when it landed on her. Martha's eyes were pale blue, faded by sun and age, but still sharp, still seeing more than surface appearances. Eyes that had watched children grow and men go to war, and seasons turn for 7 decades. Eyes that had seen enough to know the difference between genuine interest and polite performance. But Wade tells me you girls have been working hard, learning respectfully, says you're trying to become better than you were. That means something to me. That suggests you understand that being defeated in war doesn't mean you have to be defeated in spirit, that you can choose what you become next. She set her worn recipe card on the counter with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. The card was yellowed with age, stained with decades of kitchen use, the handwriting faded but still legible. An artifact of continuity connecting past to present through the simple medium of food preparation. So I'm going to trust you with something my family holds dear, but you got to promise me you'll treat it with the honor it deserves. You'll learn it right. You'll remember where it came from. And maybe someday, when all this awfulness is behind us, you'll teach it to your own daughters and tell them about the summer you spent in Texas learning to make fried chicken from an old woman who believed people could be better than their worst moments. Elise felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. This old woman was offering them more than a recipe. She was offering trust, acceptance, a piece of her family's heritage, to enemy prisoners, to women whose country had killed American sons and brothers and husbands. The generosity of it felt almost unbearable, a weight that pressed against her chest and made breathing difficult. Around her, the other women murmured their promises in German, their voices soft with something that might have been emotion or might have been the kind of automatic response that years of military discipline had trained into them. Luis translated, his voice steady. "We promise." Martha smiled, and the expression transformed her weathered features. The lines around her eyes deepened, but they were laugh lines, joy lines, the marks of a life lived with more happiness than sorrow, despite the losses war had brought. "All right then, let's begin." First thing you need to understand is that good fried chicken starts the night before. You can't rush it. You can't decide at 4 o'clock you want fried chicken for supper and expect it to turn out right. This isn't food you make in a hurry. This is food that requires patience and planning and respect for the process. She pulled out a large earthenware bowl and began demonstrating, as she spoke, her hands moving with the confidence of countless repetitions. You gotta let the chicken soak in buttermilk with salt and hot sauce for at least 12 hours. Overnight is best. That's what makes it tender and gives it that tang that keeps people coming back for more. The acid in the buttermilk breaks down the proteins, makes the meat tender all the way through, not just on the surface. She poured buttermilk from one of the containers she had brought, the thick white liquid flowing slowly into the bowl. Now the proportions matter. You want enough buttermilk to cover the chicken completely, every piece submerged, but not so much you're wasting it. About 2 cups for every 3 pounds of chicken. That's the ratio you need to remember. Martha measured salt into her palm with the practiced eye of someone who had stopped using measuring spoons decades ago. 2 tablespoons of salt for this amount. And hot sauce, just a few dashes. Not too much, though. You want folks to taste the chicken, not just the fire. The heat should be a whisper, not a shout. Something you notice after you swallow, not something that burns your mouth. Elise and the other women gathered close, watching as Martha's weathered hands worked with precision and grace. The old woman's fingers were gnarled with arthritis, the knuckles swollen and crooked, but they moved surely through motions they had performed thousands of times. Measuring, mixing, explaining. This wasn't just cooking instruction. This was ritual being passed down. This was inheritance being shared. This was one generation teaching another the accumulated wisdom of those who had come before, the kind of knowledge that couldn't be written in books, but had to be demonstrated, practiced, felt in the hands, and tasted on the tongue. Clara stepped forward, her practical nature making her the first to engage directly. In German, she asked about the type of chicken, whether younger birds worked better than older ones, whether the size of the pieces mattered. Louise translated, and Martha's face lit up with approval at the questions. "Smart girl. Yes, younger chickens are better for frying. They're more tender to start with. And yes, the size matters. You want pieces that are roughly equal so they cook at the same rate. Nothing worse than burning the wings while the breasts are still raw in the middle. That's why you cut carefully, thinking about how the heat will penetrate each piece." She moved to the next step, pulling out a large bowl and bags of flour and spices. Now, while the chicken is soaking overnight, you need to prepare your seasoned flour. This is where the real magic happens. This is where you take something good and make it transcendent. The secret's in the seasoned flour. You need salt, black pepper, paprika, and just a touch of cayenne for heat. The proportions are important. 3 cups flour, 2 tablespoons salt, 1 tablespoon black pepper, 1 tablespoon paprika, half a teaspoon cayenne. Mix it together real well before you start coating the chicken. You want every grain of flour to carry some of that seasoning. She demonstrated measuring each ingredient with care despite her apparent ability to eyeball measurements. When teaching, precision mattered. When cooking alone, experience could guide. But to pass knowledge to others required being explicit, being clear, leaving nothing to assumption or guesswork. Her hands worked the dry ingredients together until they formed an even mixture, the white flour taking on a subtle color from the paprika and cayenne, the black pepper visible as tiny dark flecks throughout. You see how it looks, that pale peachy brown color. That's what you're aiming for. Too much paprika, and it gets bitter when it burns. Too little, and you lose the color and the sweet pepper flavor. Then you take your chicken out of the buttermilk, let the excess drip off, and you coat it in this flour. Make sure you press the flour into the skin, get it into all the crevices, every wrinkle and fold. That's what makes it crispy. The flour clinging to every surface, creating texture when it hits the hot oil. Frida asked a question in halting English, something about whether you could use other meats, whether pork would work with this method. Martha's smile widened. You could, she acknowledged, but chicken is special. Chicken is what we've always used. Chicken is what my grandmother taught my mother, what my mother taught me, what I'm teaching you. There's power in tradition. There's meaning in keeping something alive across generations. When you make this chicken the way I'm teaching you, you're connected to every Crawford woman who came before. You're part of something larger than yourself. Now the oil, Martha said, turning to the cast iron skillet she had brought. This is important. You want lard, not vegetable oil. Lard gets hotter and makes a crispier crust. It's what we've always used on ranches because that's what we had. Vegetable oil is fine for other things, but for this, you want lard. She filled the skillet about halfway, the white lard melting quickly in the heat. You heat it until a pinch of flour sizzles when you drop it in, but doesn't burn immediately. That's how you know it's ready. Too cool and the flour absorbs oil and gets greasy. Too hot and it burns before the chicken cooks through. It's a balance, and you learn it by paying attention, by watching and listening and even smelling the oil as it heats. Martha waited for the oil to reach temperature, testing it with pinches of flour, adjusting the heat on the stove with small turns of the knob. When she was satisfied, she placed the first piece of chicken in the skillet with a practiced motion that suggested decades of avoiding splatter burns. It sizzled to life, the sound filling the kitchen with a promise of something good. The smell intensified immediately, the seasoned flour beginning to crisp and brown, releasing aromatics that made everyone lean slightly closer despite themselves. You don't move it around, Martha instructed. That's mistake number one that people make. They want to fuss with it, flip it too early, check it constantly. You let it sit, let the crust form, let the heat do its work. When it's golden brown on one side, about 7 or 8 minutes, then you flip it. Not before. Patience is part of the recipe just as much as salt and pepper. Elise watched, fascinated by more than just the cooking technique. This level of care and attention to something as simple as fried chicken spoke to a culture she didn't fully understand. A culture where food was more than fuel for the body, where cooking was love made tangible and service made visible, where recipes were treasures passed through generations like family heirlooms, carrying not just instructions, but stories and values and connections to those who had come before. In Germany, food had become a matter of survival, of stretching rations, of making do with substitutes and supplements, of eating to stay alive rather than eating for pleasure or connection or tradition. The war had stripped food of everything but utility, reduced it to calories and nutrients, removed the joy and the ritual and the community aspects that had once surrounded meals. Watching Martha Crawford teach her family recipe with such care and pride reminded Elise of what had been lost, not just in the war, but in the ideology that had led to war. The Reich had spoken of blood and soil, of the sacred connection between people and land. But in practice, it had treated both as resources to be exploited. Food was fuel for soldiers. Land was territory to be conquered. There was no room for the kind of generosity Martha was demonstrating, the sharing of heritage with strangers, with enemies even. Martha turned to Elise, her sharp eyes softening in a way that suggested she saw more than just a German prisoner. You want to try the next piece, honey? The word landed like a benediction, and Elise felt her composure threaten to crack. Honey, said with casual affection, the diminutive term of endearment that you would use with a granddaughter or a beloved niece. When was the last time someone had called her anything other than her rank or her prisoner number? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen a person worth cherishing, rather than an enemy to be managed or a problem to be processed? She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. Martha guided her through the process, standing close enough that Elise could smell lavender soap and something else, something that might have been the scent of sun-dried laundry or fresh baked bread or just the accumulated smell of a life well lived. One weathered hand rested lightly on Elise's shoulder as she picked up a piece of chicken from the buttermilk bath, let it drip, dredged it through the seasoned flour, pressed the coating into every surface. Martha's touch was gentle but firm, guiding without controlling, teaching through physical presence as much as verbal instruction. That's it, honey. You're doing just fine, not too much pressure, or you'll squeeze the buttermilk out, just enough to make sure the flour sticks. There you go. Now into the oil and remember to lay it away from you so if there's splatter, it doesn't come toward your face. Elise lowered the chicken into the hot oil, and the sizzle that rose up was deeply satisfying in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The simple touch, the simple kindness, the simple act of being taught something valuable by someone who cared enough to teach it well, all of it combined to crack something inside Elise that she had been holding carefully together since her capture. She blinked hard against tears, focusing on the chicken, on the sizzle and pop of oil, on Martha's patient voice, explaining temperature and timing, and the importance of not overcrowding the pan. Focus on the technical details. Focus on the measurements and methods. Don't think about how long it had been since someone had touched her with kindness. Don't think about how good it felt to be called honey. Don't think about how much she missed her own mother, her own home, the life she had lost piece by piece over the past 3 years. Behind them, unseen by the women absorbed in their lesson, the kitchen door opened quietly. Lieutenant Robert Kane stood in the doorway, clipboard in hand, his expression carefully neutral as he observed the scene before him. He had been at Camp Swift for less than a week, but he had spent that time productively, reading personnel files late into the night, watching the interactions between guards and prisoners during the day, taking notes on everything that might constitute inappropriate fraternization or deviation from proper prisoner management protocols. And this, he thought, as he watched Martha Crawford teach German women her family's fried chicken recipe. This was exactly the kind of deviation he had been looking for. German women laughing at something one of the church ladies said, the sound carrying across the kitchen despite the language barrier. Luis translating jokes about the Texas heat and how even the chickens were too hot to lay eggs in summer. The smell of frying chicken filling the air with an aroma that spoke of home and comfort and family traditions. Martha Crawford's weathered hand resting on the shoulder of a woman who had served the Third Reich, teaching her, touching her, treating her like a granddaughter rather than an enemy prisoner. Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was not appropriate prisoner management. This was not maintaining proper professional distance. This was allowing emotional attachments to form that would make the eventual repatriation process more difficult for everyone involved. He watched for another moment, cataloging details for his report, then turned and walked to where he knew he would find Wade Crawford, watching from the window, unable to fully participate in his mother's lesson, but unable to stay away either. Caught between duty and family, between professional requirements and personal values. Kane found Wade exactly where he expected, standing near the window of the mess hall, his eyes on the kitchen building across the compound. His posture was tense, his hands clasped behind his back in a way that suggested he was physically restraining himself from some action. Sergeant Crawford, Kane's voice was professional, almost friendly. A word if you don't mind. Wade's entire body tensed further, but he turned and followed Kane outside the mess hall. They stood in the shade of the overhang, the Texas sun beating down on the dusty compound around them, heat radiating up from the ground in waves that made the air shimmer. Kane kept his voice level, conversational, the tone of one professional speaking to another about a matter of mutual concern. Are you aware that fraternization with enemy prisoners beyond necessary supervision is against regulations? Sergeant Wade met his eyes steadily, and Kane could see the man's jaw muscles working. Colonel Garrett approved the cooking lesson, sir. I have the authorization in writing, if you'd like to see it. I'm not questioning the colonel's authority, Kane said smoothly, his voice remaining calm and reasonable. I'm questioning whether teaching our family recipes to German prisoners constitutes appropriate prisoner management, whether allowing your mother and other civilian women to form personal relationships with enemy combatants serves the interests of proper camp discipline and eventual repatriation. The words hit Wade like physical blows, though his expression remained controlled. These women are entitled to Geneva Convention protection, sir. The war's over. They surrendered. Humane treatment includes opportunities for productive activity and skill development. Absolutely, Kane agreed, his tone suggesting complete reasonableness, even as his words cut deeper. Geneva Convention protections include adequate food shelter, medical care, and humane treatment. They include work assignments that provide purpose and structure, but they do not include family intimacy. They do not include teaching them recipes that have been in your family for generations. They do not include allowing civilian women, including your own mother, to form emotional attachments to enemy combatants who will be leaving in a matter of months. He paused, watching Wade's face, seeing the conflict playing out behind the man's careful mask. Wade, I understand what you're trying to do. I respect it even. You're a good man trying to do the right thing in a difficult situation. But kindness is one thing. This is something else entirely. What exactly is it? Sir Wade's voice was tight, controlled, each word carefully measured. This is forgetting that these women were our enemies, that they contributed to American deaths, that they served a regime that murdered millions and started a war that killed tens of millions more, that they don't deserve to be treated like family members or welcomed into our traditions as if the past 3 years didn't happen. Kane's voice softened just slightly, taking on a tone of understanding, of shared grief, of one man who had lost a brother speaking to another who had suffered similar loss. I know about your brother Wade. Private Billy Crawford, killed at Normandy, June 6, 1944, 22 years old. I know because I did my research, because I understand what it means to lose family to this war. Wade's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles going white with pressure. My brother James died at Normandy too, Captain James Kane. He led his men onto Omaha Beach based on intelligence that said resistance would be light. The intelligence was wrong, deliberately falsified by German signals officers working in occupied France. My brother and most of his company died in the first wave, cut down by machine gun fire from positions that weren't supposed to be there. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. I've been reviewing personnel files. Kane continued, his voice still reasonable, still professional, still the tone of one man trying to help another see clearly. These women in your mother's kitchen aren't just generic prisoners. They have specific histories, specific roles they played in the German war machine. And allowing them into your or family's traditions without understanding what they did, what they might have contributed to, that's not kindness, that's negligence. Wade wanted to argue, wanted to say that Billy would have wanted mercy, that hatred helped no one, that choosing kindness in the face of grief was the hardest thing a man could do, and maybe that made it the most important, that judging people by what they might have done rather than who they were trying to become was the path to endless cycles of revenge and counter-revenge. But the words stuck in his throat because part of him, the part that still burned with rage and loss and the injustice of Billy's death, agreed with everything Kane was saying. Part of him wanted to know exactly what each of these women had done during the war, what messages they had decoded, what intelligence they had transmitted, whether their efficient work had contributed to American deaths. Instead, he said quietly, his voice strained, "I'll make sure regulations are followed to the letter, sir." Kane nodded, his expression suggesting satisfaction with the outcome, but also a kind of sympathy, as if he understood how difficult this was and respected Wade for making the right choice despite the personal cost. "That's all I'm asking, Sergeant. Maintain proper professional distance. Remember that these women are temporary guests who will be leaving soon. Don't let your mother or anyone else form attachments that will make separation painful when the time comes." He walked away, leaving Wade standing in the heat, his mother's laughter drifting from the kitchen building across the compound, the smell of fried chicken reminding him of every Sunday dinner Billy had ever sat through, grinning and asking for seconds, and telling jokes that made their mama swat him with a dish towel while trying not to laugh. Inside the kitchen, Martha was letting each woman try their hand at frying a piece of chicken, offering gentle corrections and enthusiastic praise in equal measure. Clara's piece came out perfectly golden, the coating crispy and even, and Martha declared it restaurant quality. Frida's was slightly too dark on one side, but Martha just smiled and said it happened to everyone when they were learning, and the next one would be better. When it was Elise's turn again, she concentrated fiercely, determined to get it right to prove that she was worthy of this trust being placed in her. She monitored the oil temperature, watched the color development, carefully resisted the urge to flip too early. And when she finally turned the chicken and saw that it was exactly the right shade of golden brown, she felt a small surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. The chicken emerged from the oil perfect, and Martha beamed. Now that's how it's done, honey. You're a natural. You've got the touch for this. Some people never get it right no matter how many times they try. But you understand it. You can feel when it's ready. But even as Martha praised her, Elise had caught sight of Wade and Lieutenant Kane talking through the window, had seen the tension in Wade's shoulders, the tightness in his jaw when he returned to watching the lesson, had felt the atmosphere shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Something had changed. Something had been said. The ease of the first days was gone, replaced by a watchfulness that felt like waiting for consequences. Like knowing that bills always came due and accounts always had to be balanced, and the kindness they had received would have to be paid for somehow, sometime in ways they could not yet anticipate. She turned back to the chicken, to Martha's patient instruction, to the simple act of learning something useful from someone who cared about teaching it well. But the shadow had fallen across the kitchen, and no amount of golden fried chicken could completely dispel it. 1 week later, on June 24th, Wade brought Elise a letter. She was working in the camp laundry when he appeared in the doorway, his expression somber in ways that went beyond his usual controlled professionalism. He held a single envelope, thin and worn from travel, addressed in handwriting that Elise recognized immediately. His voice was gentle when he spoke, the gentleness of someone delivering news they knew would hurt. First mail call, this one's for you. I'm sorry it took so long to get here. The Red Cross channels are slow and mail from occupied zones is even slower. Elise accepted the letter with hands that began to shake before she even touched it. She recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope, immediately the familiar loops and curves that she had seen on birthday cards, in shopping lists, and notes left on the kitchen table throughout her childhood. But the handwriting looked different now. Shakier, less confident. The writing of someone whose hand trembled from more than just age. She carried the letter to her spot under the mesquite tree at the edge of the compound, the place she had claimed over the past weeks as her thinking space. The place she went when she needed to breathe, to remember who she had been before the war, made her into someone she barely recognized, to imagine who she might become if she survived whatever came next. The tree provided some shade from the brutal afternoon sun, its twisted branches creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. She sat with her back against the trunk, feeling the rough bark through her thin uniform, and carefully opened the envelope. The letter was written on paper so thin it was nearly transparent, clearly salvaged from whatever supplies remained in Munich. Paper that had probably been used for something else, originally carefully preserved and reused because new paper was impossible to find. Her mother's usually neat script was shaky, the words wandering across the page, as if written by an unsteady hand, or in poor light, or while fighting against emotions that made precision difficult. My dearest Elise. The salutation alone made her throat tighten. How long had it been since she had been anyone's dearest anything? Since she had been loved rather than just tolerated or managed or processed through systems designed to handle large numbers of people with minimum individual attention. I pray this letter finds you alive and well. We only recently learned through the Red Cross that you are a prisoner in America in a place called Texas. Your father and I thank God you are safe, even if you are so far away. So impossibly far. The distance feels like more than just miles. It feels like worlds between us. Elise's throat tightened further. She read faster, hungry for news of home, dreading what that news might contain, the two impulses warring against each other until she felt sick with anticipation. Munich has been bombed repeatedly in the war's final months. The raids that had been sporadic became constant. Day and night, the sirens never stopped. Our apartment building is gone reduced to rubble in a raid that killed 37 people in our neighborhood alone. People we knew, the Schneiders from downstairs, the Vogel family with their 3 children, Mrs. Hoffman, who used to give you candy when you were small, all gone in one night. Your father and I are living in 2 rooms of a partially destroyed house with 3 other families. We share one kitchen, one bathroom that works when there is water pressure. The walls are cracked, the windows are covered with boards because there is no glass to replace what the bombs broke. We share whatever food we can find. The rations are small, people are hungry, but we are alive, and for that we must be grateful. Elise could picture it with terrible clarity. Her parents, who had lived in the same spacious apartment for 30 years, now cramped into 2 rooms with strangers. Her father, who valued privacy and quiet for his reading and thinking, now unable to escape the maze and presence of other people. Her mother, who took pride in keeping a neat home, now unable to maintain any space that was truly hers. Your father lost his teaching position because of his party affiliation. They are removing anyone who joined, regardless of whether they were true believers or just people trying to keep their jobs and feed their families. He now works clearing debris from the streets for meager rations. It is hard work for a man his age. His back hurts constantly. His hands bleed, but he does not complain. We are luckier than many, at least he has work. Then came the paragraph that made Elise's vision blur, the words swimming on the page until she had to blink hard to clear her eyes. The paragraph that changed everything. Your brother Klaus. We received the Red Cross notification in April. He fell near Berlin in the final days of fighting, just days before the surrender. The cruelty of that timing, that he survived so much only to die when the end was already visible, makes it somehow worse. They did not return his body. We have no grave to visit, no place to say goodbye. There is a mass grave somewhere, they said, but they cannot tell us where. I do not know how to grieve someone with no grave. I do not know how to mourn a son whose body is lost among thousands of others. I do not know how to accept that both my babies are lost to me. You so far away I may never see you again. Klaus gone forever into earth that does not even carry his name. Elise pressed the letter against her chest, unable to read further. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. Klaus, her baby brother, the boy who had been 7 years old when she left for university, who had cried because he thought she would never come home. The boy who had followed her around during school holidays, asking endless questions about everything, believing she knew all the answers. The young man who had hugged her fiercely when she left for her posting in France, making her promise to come home safe to write letters to remember him. 20 years old, dead, no body, no grave, no marker, no place for her parents to lay flowers or sit in quiet remembrance. Just a notification through official channels, impersonal and final. Your son is dead. We're sorry for your loss. We cannot tell you where he is buried or even if he received burial, rather than being left where he fell. These things happen in war. Accept our regrets and move on. Around the compound, other women were receiving their letters. Through eyes blurred with tears, Elise could see Clara sitting on the barrack steps, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that her nursing training had taught her to suppress but could not entirely contain. Frida walked in circles in the yard, reading and rereading her letter, her lips moving as if she couldn't believe the words and needed to speak them aloud to make them real. Ingrid Vogel simply stared at nothing, a letter hanging loose in her fingers, whatever news it contained having stolen even her defiant anger, leaving her hollow and broken. 15 of the 23 women received similar letters that day. Fathers dead in bombing raids. Mothers missing in the chaos of occupation. Sisters dead from starvation or disease. Brothers killed in the final desperate battles when Germany threw children and old men against Allied tanks because there was no one else left. Cities destroyed, homes gone. Everything they had known reduced to rubble and ash and memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The grief was universal, but each woman carried it differently. Some wept openly, no longer caring who saw their tears. Others held it inside German discipline and pride, making them suffer in silence. A few sought comfort in each other, holding hands or embracing in ways that broke through the careful distance they had maintained as prisoners trying to preserve individual dignity. Elise sat alone under the mesquite tree, the letter pressed against her chest, trying to process the enormity of what she had lost. Klaus was gone, her childhood companion, her protector when she was small and he grew bigger, her student when she came home from university with new knowledge to share, her fellow victim of their parents' expectations and hopes, dead in the mud outside Berlin. 19 years of life ended by a bullet or shell or who knew what. She would never know the details, would never be able to picture his last moments, would never have the closure of understanding how and why and whether it was quick or prolonged, painless or agonizing. The not knowing was its own torture, leaving imagination to fill the void with scenarios that varied from merciful to horrific. Her mind cycled through possibilities she could not stop or control. Klaus shot cleanly, dying before he knew what happened. Klaus wounded and left to bleed out, slowly crying for help that never came. Klaus terrified in his final moments, a boy playing soldier, finding out too late that war was nothing like the propaganda promised. She forced herself to read the rest of the letter, though the words were like swallowing ground glass. Please try to find moments of peace even there. Klaus would want you to live, not just survive. He spoke of you often before he was called up. He was proud of you, proud that his sister was serving the fatherland. I did not have the heart to tell him, near the end, that I had begun to question what we were serving, that I had started to see the difference between love of country and obedience to monsters. He died still believing. Perhaps that is a mercy, to die with faith intact rather than to survive and face the disillusionment. I do not know if I will ever see you again. The distance is too great. The world is too broken. But know that you are loved, that you are remembered, that whatever you become in that strange country, you carry us with you. Your father sends his love. He cannot write himself. His hands shake too much now. But he wants you to know he is proud of you, that he understands why you might choose to stay if given the chance. That home is where you build it, not always where you were born. Your loving mother, that final paragraph, that suggestion that she might choose to stay, that her parents, even in their grief and displacement, could imagine her building a life somewhere else. The generosity of it, the selflessness, the understanding that sometimes love meant letting go rather than holding tight. Elise sat under the mesquite tree until the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink that were beautiful in ways that felt obscene given what she had just learned. How dare the world be beautiful when Klaus was dead? How dare the sunset be magnificent when her parents were living in rubble? How dare she sit safe and fed in a place where kindness was offered freely while her family suffered? That evening, the women gathered in the mess hall for dinner, but the usual conversations were absent. They sat in heavy silence, pushing food around their plates with mechanical motions. The fried chicken that had seemed like such a gift just weeks ago now felt like an accusation, each bite an indictment. Their families were starving in Germany, living in ruins, mourning their dead, digging through rubble for belongings, burning furniture for warmth, trading precious possessions for bread. And here the women sat well-fed and safe and comfortable, protected by the very people who had helped destroy their homeland, protected by the bombers that had reduced Munich to rubble, protected by the soldiers who had killed Klaus and Ingrid's brother and all the other brothers and fathers and sons. Elise looked at the food before her, then at the letter she still clutched in her other hand. The paper was damp now from sweat and tears. The ink had smudged in places where her fingers had gripped too tight. How could she eat when her mother was hungry? How could she accept kindness when Klaus was dead? How could she laugh and learn recipes and feel moments of almost peace when everything she had loved was gone? Across the room, Wade Crawford watched from the kitchen doorway. He had seen enough men receive bad news from home to recognize grief when he saw it. Had watched soldiers open letters and go pale, had watched them cry or rage, or simply shut down each person processing devastating news in their own way. He wanted to offer comfort, but knew that some wounds were too fresh for words from anyone, especially from former enemies. What could he possibly say to women mourning brothers killed by American bullets? What comfort could he offer that wouldn't sound like hypocrisy or cruel triumph barely disguised as sympathy? Ingrid Vogel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the heavy silence. She spoke in rapid German, her voice sharp with anger and pain and accusation, the words pouring out in a torrent that needed no translation to convey their emotional content. Luis Ramirez translated quietly for the guards, though the emotion needed no translation. The grief and rage were universal languages. You sit here eating their food while our families starve in ruins. You laugh with their mothers while ours dig through rubble for scraps to survive. You learn their recipes and smile and act grateful while our brothers rot in unmarked graves, their bodies not even afforded the dignity of individual burial. This is what surrender looks like. This is what happens to those who forget who they are, who forget where they came from, who accept kindness from people whose bombs killed our loved ones. Clara looked up, her eyes red but her voice steady with the kind of practical determination that had made her a good nurse. What would you have us do? Ingrid, starve ourselves in solidarity, refuse kindness out of pride, reject every good thing offered because accepting it feels like betrayal. Our families would not want that. The dead would not want that. They would want us to survive, to live, to build something from the ashes. The dead would want us to remember them. Ingrid shot back, her young face twisted with grief and rage. To honor them, not to make friends with their killers, not to learn recipes and smile and forget that these people destroyed everything we knew. Elise found her voice, though it came out hoarse and raw. My brother would want me to live, not just survive. Live. That's what his last letter said, the one that came just before he was called up. He wrote, live good, Elise. Don't let the war make you small. Don't let hate eat you up. Don't become the worst version of yourself just because the world is terrible. She looked around the room at her fellow prisoners, at the guards who had shown them nothing but professional courtesy and unexpected kindness at the untouched food on the tables. Klaus would not want me to starve myself because he is gone. He would want me to eat, to grow strong, to build something from the ruins, even if I don't know yet what that something is, even if it feels like betrayal, even if I don't understand how to hold grief and gratitude in the same heart at the same time. Ingrid shook her head, disgusted, and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the silence. But the other women remained, and slowly, hesitantly, they began to eat, not with joy, not with gratitude, but with the grim determination of people who had decided that survival was its own form of resistance, that living well even in captivity was a way of honoring the dead, that refusing to be broken by grief was a kind of victory that bombs and bullets could not take away. Wade watched this exchange from the doorway, understanding without needing translation the core of what was being debated: to accept kindness from enemies, to move forward while carrying grief, to choose life in the face of devastating loss, to navigate the impossible space between loyalty to the dead and responsibility to the living. He had been wrestling with these same questions for 8 months since the telegram about Billy, since the rage and sorrow had threatened to consume everything good in him, since he had started seeing Billy's face in every German uniform and hearing Billy's voice in the silence that followed bad news. He understood the temptation to let grief become hatred, to transform loss into a weapon you could use against others, to find some kind of purpose in revenge, even if that purpose was hollow and destructive. He thought of Billy's last letter, the one that had arrived 3 weeks after his death, written by a young man who still believed in goodness and mercy, even as he prepared for battle. Billy writing about treating prisoners with dignity, about remembering that everyone was somebody's son or brother, about not letting war turn you into someone your mama wouldn't recognize. Wade made a decision then, one he had been avoiding for weeks, one that terrified him because it meant letting go of the protective armor of grief and anger, one that required more courage than any battlefield decision because it meant being vulnerable, meant choosing hope over safety, meant believing that people could change and grow and become better than their worst moments. He walked into the mess hall and stood at the front, waiting until the women looked up from their plates. Luis stepped beside him, ready to translate his expression, suggesting he knew something significant was about to happen. Ladies, Wade began, his voice rough with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. Next week is July 4th. That's America's Independence Day, our biggest holiday. Colonel Garrett and I have been talking, and we'd like to invite you to participate in the celebration we're having here at camp. The women exchanged confused glances, and Elise could see the same questions on their faces that echoed in her own mind. Luis translated into German, and the confusion deepened. Participate in an American patriotic celebration. Celebrate independence and freedom while they were prisoners. Celebrate with people who had killed their brothers while the letters announcing those deaths still sat in their pockets. It seemed absurd, perhaps even cruel given the news they had just received. A test or a trap or some kind of psychological manipulation designed to break them further. But Wade continued, his voice gentle but firm, each word chosen carefully. I know you just got hard news from home. I know you're grieving in ways that probably feel impossible to carry, and probably feeling mighty conflicted about everything, about being here, about accepting our food, about whether kindness from us is real or just another kind of cruelty. But here's the thing. He paused, and in that pause, Elise could see the weight he was carrying, could see the grief that matched their own. We can't change what happened in the war. We can't bring back the folks who were lost. We can't rebuild the cities that were destroyed or give you back the time you lost or erase the things you saw and did. But we can decide how we move forward from here. We can choose what we become next. The celebration's going to be simple. Food, some music, maybe some games if folks are feeling up to it. Children running around being loud because they don't understand yet what war does to people. Families trying to remember what normal feels like. You don't have to come if you don't want to. Nobody will force you. Nobody will judge you. But if you do, you're welcome. Not as prisoners, but as guests, as people who deserve a few hours of forgetting that the world is broken. There was no triumph in his expression as he spoke. No celebration of Germany's defeat. No gloating over Allied victory. Instead, Elise saw something that looked almost like understanding. Like Wade Crawford, too, carried the weight of loss and knew what it meant to be caught between grief and the need to keep living. Like he was offering them not charity, but fellowship in suffering, an acknowledgement that war had broken everyone, winners and losers alike, and maybe that shared brokenness was something to build on. That night in the barracks, the women argued among themselves, voices rising and falling in the darkness as they wrestled with the impossible decision. Clara was adamant that attending would be a betrayal of everything, her nurse's practicality failing her when emotions ran this high. How can we celebrate with them while our families suffer? She demanded, her voice sharp with anger and pain that had nowhere else to go. Klaus is dead, Elise. Your brother is dead. Mine is missing. Frida's husband hasn't been heard from in months. Ingrid's brother died on a beach in Normandy, and they want us to eat barbecue and wave American flags and pretend like none of it matters. Like we're all just friends who had a little disagreement that's over now. We're not being asked to celebrate Germany's defeat, Frida said quietly, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been crying for hours. She had been silent since receiving her letter about Dresden, about the firestorm that had consumed the entire city center, about her family burning to death in their basement shelter, while she sat safe in a Texas prison camp. We're being asked to be human for one day instead of just prisoners and enemies and broken people carrying unbearable grief. To remember that we are more than what the war made us, more than our worst moments and our greatest losses. Elise found herself thinking about Martha Crawford, about the patience in the old woman's hands as she taught them to cook, about Wade's quiet kindness that never asked for gratitude or acknowledgement, about the way the guards treated them not as monsters who deserved punishment, but as people who deserved dignity even in defeat. She pulled her mother's letter from her pocket, the paper soft now from being handled, and read the last line again, by moonlight coming through the window. Please try to find moments of peace even there. Klaus would want you to live, not just survive. Maybe Elise whispered into the darkness, we can honor our dead by choosing to live. The room fell silent, the weight of that choice settling over them. Outside, cicadas sang their endless summer song, and the Texas heat pressed against the windows like something physical. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A guard called to another, the normal sounds of a world that continued despite everything. Frida spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears that had been falling all day. I will attend, not to celebrate their victory, not to forget Germany or pretend the war didn't happen, but to remember that I'm still alive, that being alive means something even when everyone you loved is gone. Clara looked at her friend with something that might have been betrayal, but after a long moment she nodded slowly. I will too, not for them, for us, to show that we are still here, still standing, still human despite everything that tried to make us less than human. One by one, the other women made their choices. 14 of the 23 decided to attend. 9 refused, including Ingrid, who looked at those who had chosen to go with disgust that was really just grief wearing different clothes. But Elise barely noticed the division in the room. She was thinking about the choice she had just made, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. To attend an Independence Day celebration while her brother lay in an unmarked grave somewhere near Berlin. To accept hospitality from the people whose country had destroyed hers. To choose forward movement instead of staying frozen in grief and anger and the terrible paralysis that came from loss so profound it threatened to swallow everything. It felt like betrayal of everything she had been. It felt like survival in a world that offered no good choices. It felt like the hardest decision she had ever made. And she knew with the kind of soul-deep certainty that comes only rarely in a lifetime that this choice would echo through the rest of her life in ways she could not yet imagine, could not yet prepare for, could not escape, even if she tried. July 4th, 1945. The heat broke just before dawn, a brief mercy that wouldn't last past noon. Elise woke to the sound of trucks arriving and American families streaming through the gates of Camp Swift with children in picnic baskets, and the kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested they were working hard to reclaim normalcy after years of war anxiety and rationing and casualty lists that never seemed to end. She dressed carefully in the cleanest uniform she could manage, though no amount of washing could remove the permanent stains of travel and captivity. Her hands trembled as she buttoned the gray fabric, each button a small act of courage or betrayal. She still wasn't sure which. In the barracks, 14 women prepared themselves with varying degrees of conviction. Clara braided her blonde hair with mechanical precision, her face set in determined lines that suggested she was doing this through sheer force of will rather than desire. Frida stood at the window, watching the American families arrive, her expression unreadable, though Elise noticed her fingers gripping the windowsill white-knuckled. From her bunk in the corner, Ingrid watched them with undisguised contempt. She had positioned herself as far from the others as possible, turned toward the wall, her body language screaming rejection of everything they represented. 9 other women had joined her boycott, and they sat together in small clusters, speaking in low voices about loyalty and honor, and not forgetting who they were. The celebration was set up in the open area between the barracks and the mess hall. Long tables had been assembled, from sawhorses and planks covered with checkered cloths that fluttered in the morning breeze. American flags hung from posts, the red and white stripes bright against the pale Texas sky. Children ran between the tables shrieking with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only children could maintain too young to understand the complicated grief their parents carried. Martha Crawford stood near the cooking area supervising three enormous grills where chicken and beef were already beginning to smoke. She wore a simple cotton dress printed with small flowers, her silver hair pinned up against the heat, her weathered face creased with determination. When she spotted the German women emerging hesitantly from their barracks, her face broke into a smile that seemed to push back the shadows of war and loss in complicated history. She crossed the yard with surprising speed for a woman her age, moving directly to Elise and taking both her hands in a grip that was firm and warm and impossibly kind. "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you came. I wasn't sure if you would after those letters. I'm so sorry about your brother. So sorry for all your losses, but I'm grateful you're here. Grateful you chose to live today instead of just surviving." The words translated quickly by Louise, who hovered nearby, broke something loose in Elise's chest. She had been holding herself together through sheer determination, but Martha's genuine sympathy, the acknowledgement of Klaus's death without platitudes or attempts to minimize the loss, cracked her careful control. Tears spilled before she could stop them, and then Martha was pulling her into an embrace that smelled of lavender and wood smoke and something that might have been hope. For just a moment, Elise allowed herself to be held, to be comforted by this woman who had no obligation to care about a German prisoner's grief. To accept that kindness and loss could exist simultaneously, that you could mourn your dead and still choose to be present among the living, that survival sometimes looked like eating barbecue at your enemy's celebration while your brother rotted in an unmarked grave. Then she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain some composure. Martha just smiled and pressed a handkerchief into Elise's palm, patted her cheek with one weathered hand, and said something in English that Louise translated as, "That's it, honey. Let it out. Grief don't get smaller by holding it in. It gets smaller by living through it." The celebration unfolded around them with a strange normality that felt almost surreal. American families mingled with guards and prisoners, the boundaries between groups blurring as children chased each other without regard for nationality or politics. The smell of grilling meat filled the air, mixing with the scent of fresh baked bread and something sweet that Elise would later learn was apple pie, an American tradition Martha insisted on despite the sugar rationing. Elise found herself at a table with Clara and Frida, watching the chaos with a mixture of wonder and disorientation. A small American girl, perhaps 5 years old with blonde pigtails, approached their table with the fearless curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to see enemies. She held out a small American flag, offering it to Elise with a gap-toothed smile. "For you," the child said in English, her voice high and sweet. "Happy Independence Day." Elise took the flag with shaking hands, not knowing what else to do. The child beamed and ran off to her mother, who watched from nearby with an expression that held wariness and something that might have been approval. Elise stared at the flag in her hands, the stars and stripes bright against her gray uniform, and felt the weight of symbolism pressing down on her like physical force. She was a German prisoner holding an American flag at an Independence Day celebration, while her homeland lay in ruins and her brother lay in an unmarked grave. The absurdity of it should have been crushing. Instead, it felt oddly freeing, as if she had been released from some obligation to perform grief in specific ways to maintain loyalty to an ideology that had destroyed everything she loved to be anything other than a broken person trying to figure out how to keep breathing. But across the yard, Lieutenant Robert Kane watched the celebration with an expression that held no joy. He stood alone near the administrative building, clipboard in hand, as always, his intelligent eyes moving over the scene with the precision of someone cataloging violations. His gaze lingered on Wade Crawford, who was helping Martha serve food, his forced smile still not quite reaching his eyes. Then Kane's attention moved to the German women scattered among the American families, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He waited until the meal was in full swing, until laughter and conversation had created enough noise to provide cover, then approached Wade with the deliberate casualness of someone who had been planning this moment carefully. "Sergeant Crawford," a word. Wade's entire body tensed, but he followed Kane away from the celebration, away from the noise and laughter and the fragile peace that had settled over the compound. They walked to the edge of the yard where the festivities gave way to empty dustland stretching toward the horizon. Kane pulled a folder from his clipboard, opening it with movements that were theatrical in their precision. "I've completed my review of the prisoner personnel files, particularly the women your mother has been teaching to cook. I thought you should know what I found." Wade said nothing, but Elise could see his hands clench into fists at his sides, could see the muscle jumping in his jaw that signaled he was grinding his teeth. "Prisoner 274, Elise Hartman, former signals officer stationed outside Lyon, France. She decoded and transmitted Wehrmacht communications for 3 years, including the 6 months leading up to the Normandy invasion. Her work provided German commanders with intelligence about Allied troop movements, supply lines, and attack plans throughout the French campaign." Kane's voice was professionally neutral, but the words landed like artillery shells, each one precisely aimed to inflict maximum damage. "Your brother Billy was killed on June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, D-Day. The intelligence that determined German defensive positions in the Normandy sector came through facilities exactly like the one where Elise Hartman worked. The messages she decoded helped German officers position their artillery and machine guns to maximum effect against the Allied landing forces." He paused, watching Wade's face, seeing the color drain from it, seeing the careful control begin to fracture. "I'm not saying she personally killed your brother. I'm saying her efficient work at that communications facility contributed to a German defensive system that killed thousands of American soldiers, including quite possibly Private Billy Crawford." Wade's voice came out strangled, barely audible. "You don't know that. You can't know that for certain. Signals intelligence went through dozens of facilities, hundreds of people. You're just guessing." M.I. Kane's voice remained calm, reasonable, the tone of someone presenting facts rather than accusations. The facility outside Lyon was one of 3 primary communications hubs for the entire Normandy sector. Every message, every transmission, every piece of intelligence about Allied movements went through one of those 3 facilities. She was there. She was working. She was efficient at her job. The Germans built their Normandy defenses based on intelligence she helped provide. Your brother died because those defenses were well-positioned and well-informed. Kane closed the folder with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "So when you watch your mother teach that woman your family's recipes, when you see her smile and laugh and learn to fry chicken the way your grandmother taught your mother, when you treat her with kindness and hospitality, I want you to remember that she might be the reason Billy never came home. She might be the reason you received that telegram. She might be the reason your mother cries every Sunday when she sets the table and realizes Billy's chair will be empty forever." Wade stood frozen, his face white, his hands trembling at his sides. The words had found their target, had penetrated every defense he had carefully constructed over the past months. The rage he had been holding at bay, the grief he had been transforming into forced hospitality, the hatred he had been battling with every act of kindness, all of it came flooding back with the force of a dam breaking. He turned without a word and walked away. Not toward the celebration, but toward the empty barracks, toward the solitude he needed to keep from doing something he would regret. Kane watched him go with an expression that held satisfaction in something else, something that might have been regret or might have been the grim pleasure of someone who believed he had done the right thing, no matter how painful. Elise saw Wade leave, saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he moved like a man carrying an unbearable weight. She did not know what Kane had said, but she knew it was about her. Knew it from the way Kane's eyes had moved to her during their conversation. Knew it from the way Wade had looked in her direction just once before walking away, his expression holding something that looked like betrayal or horror or grief. so profound it had no name. The celebration continued around her, but the joy had drained from it. The food turned to ash in her mouth. The laughter sounded hollow. The children's game seemed obscene in the face of whatever truth had just been revealed. She set down her plate and stood excusing herself in broken English to the American family who had been trying to include her in their conversation. She walked back to the barracks alone, leaving the noise and warmth behind, seeking the familiar shadows and solitude where she could think without the pressure of performing normalcy. Inside, the 9 women who had refused to attend sat in various positions of stubborn resistance. Ingrid looked up when Elise entered, and her expression shifted from contempt to something that might have been vindication. So you see it now, the truth, that their kindness was always conditional, always dependent on you not reminding them what you were, what you did. Elise didn't answer. She went to her bunk and pulled out her mother's letter, reading it again with new understanding. The parts about Klaus, the parts about choosing to live, the parts that suggested her mother had already begun the work of forgiveness, that Elise was only now beginning to understand she needed. That night, Wade Crawford sat alone in his quarters with his service pistol on the table in front of him. 3 o'clock in the morning. The celebration had ended hours ago. The families had gone home. The prisoners had returned to their barracks. The compound was silent except for the cicadas and the distant sounds of livestock and the terrible noise inside his own head. He stared at the pistol without touching it, his hands flat on the table on either side of the weapon. 8 months he had been fighting this battle. 8 months of transforming grief into forced kindness, rage into professional courtesy, hatred into hospitality that cost him something every single day. 8 months of believing that choosing mercy was the hardest thing a man could do and therefore the most important. And now Cain had given him a face, a name, a specific person who might have contributed to Billy's death, not an abstract enemy or a faceless German or a theoretical signals officer somewhere in occupied France, but Elise Hartman, 26 years old, with Klaus's death still fresh in her eyes, with her mother's letter pressed against her heart, with hands that were learning to fry chicken the way Billy had loved it. The same hands that had decoded messages that positioned German machine guns and artillery to maximum effect against Allied landing forces. The same hands that had transmitted intelligence that helped German commanders prepare for the Normandy invasion. The same hands that might have directly or indirectly contributed to the defensive system that killed Private Billy Crawford on Omaha Beach. Wade picked up the pistol, feeling its familiar weight, the cold metal against his palm. He had killed men in the war, had fired his weapon in combat situations where it was them or him kill or be killed, had made peace with that necessity, had understood that war required killing, and that killing in defense of your country and your brothers in arms was different from murder. But this would be different. This would be executing an unarmed prisoner who had surrendered, who was entitled to Geneva Convention protections, who had done nothing since her capture except try to survive and learn and become something other than what the war had made her. This would be revenge, pure and simple, the kind of revenge that would feel satisfying for about 30 seconds before the weight of it crushed him for the rest of his life. He thought about Billy, about his brother's last letter written just days before the invasion, full of hope and fear in equal measure. Billy writing about treating prisoners with dignity when the time came, about remembering that everyone was somebody's son or brother, about not letting war turn you into someone your mama wouldn't recognize. What would Billy want him to do, Billy, who had been kind to everyone, who had made friends easily, who had believed in goodness even when the world showed him darkness? Would Billy want him to execute an unarmed woman who had been following orders, just like Billy had been following orders? Would Billy want him to become the kind of man who let grief transform him into something unrecognizable? Wade set the pistol down with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He pressed his palms against his eyes, feeling tears leak through despite his efforts to maintain control. He had been so close, so terrifyingly close to throwing away everything he believed in, everything Billy had believed in, everything their mama had raised them to be. The rage was still there. The grief was still there. The hatred was still there, coiled in his chest like something living and hungry. But he wasn't going to feed it. He wasn't going to let it win. He was going to choose mercy one more time, and then the time after that, and then the time after that, for however long it took, until mercy became something other than an exhausting battle against his worst impulses. He sat in the darkness until dawn, the pistol on the table untouched, his decision made. When morning came, he would return to his duties. He would continue showing the prisoners professional courtesy and basic human decency. He would not seek revenge or justice or whatever you called it when grief demanded action. He would live with the uncertainty of not knowing for sure whether Elise Hartman had contributed to Billy's death. He would carry that weight because the alternative was becoming someone he couldn't live with. The next morning, July 5th, a guard named Danny Morrison collapsed during a shift. He was 20 years old, fresh-faced and eager, from a small town in Oklahoma, where his family had raised cattle for 3 generations. He had joined up late in the war, arrived at Camp Swift just 2 months earlier, and had been assigned to perimeter patrol. The heat had been building since dawn, the temperature climbing past 100 degrees by 10 o'clock. Danny had been walking the fence line when he suddenly dropped his body, hitting the dust hard enough to raise a small cloud. Other guards saw him fall and ran toward him, but the nearest person was Elise, who had been working in the vegetable garden just inside the fence line. She reached him first, dropping to her knees beside his body, her nursing training from mandatory Red Cross classes kicking in automatically. His face was flushed red, his skin burning to the touch. Heat stroke. Severe. Potentially fatal if not treated immediately. She didn't think about the fact that he was American and she was German. Didn't think about the fact that saving him might be seen as seeking favor or trying to earn mercy she didn't deserve. Didn't think about anything except the immediate medical crisis in front of her and the steps needed to prevent this young man from dying in the Texas dust. She shouted for help in German, then tried English, the words coming out clumsy but urgent. Watershade now. Guards came running. Clara appeared from somewhere, her nurse training making her instantly useful. Together, they dragged Danny into the shade of the nearest building, stripped off his outer uniform, to help with cooling, poured water over his head and neck and wrists. Elise elevated his feet, monitored his breathing, watched for signs of seizure or organ failure. Wade appeared Luis beside him. Both men pale when they saw Danny's condition. Wade started to take over to push the German prisoners aside and let American personnel handle their own. But Clara looked up with the kind of authority that transcended nationality or prisoner status. He needs ice if you have it. His core temperature is critically high. We need to bring it down fast or he'll have permanent brain damage. And someone needs to monitor his breathing. If it stops, we'll need to perform rescue breathing. Wade stared at her, then at Elise, seeing them not as prisoners or enemies, but as medical professionals trying to save a life. He nodded once and ran for the mess hall where they kept ice for preserving food. Within minutes, they had Danny surrounded by ice packs, his temperature slowly, carefully being brought down to safer levels. Lieutenant Kane arrived on the scene, taking in the tableau before him. German prisoners administering emergency medical care to an American guard. Clara's hands on Danny's wrist, monitoring his pulse with professional precision. Elise adjusting the ice packs, her movements efficient and sure. Wade Crawford kneeling beside his own soldier, watching enemy prisoners save an American life, with the kind of skill and dedication that made mockery of easy categories like friend and enemy. Kane watched for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something Elise never expected. He knelt beside Danny, checking his condition, then looked up at Clara and Elise with an expression that held the beginning of something that might have been respect. "What else do you need?" Clara answered without hesitation. "Continuous monitoring for the next 4 hours minimum. His temperature needs to stay stable. Any spike and we start again. And someone needs to contact proper medical personnel because I'm a nurse, not a doctor. He needs a full evaluation once he's stable." Kane nodded and stood, issuing orders to other guards with the efficiency of someone who had made a decision and would follow through regardless of personal cost. Within an hour, Danny was stable enough to be transported to the camp medical facility where a proper doctor could evaluate him. But everyone knew that without Elise and Clara's immediate intervention, he would have died in that field, his brain cooking in his skull, another casualty of war, even though the fighting had ended. That evening, Kane found Wade in the mess hall after the prisoners had been returned to their barracks. The two men sat across from each other at an empty table, the weight of unspoken things pressing down on them. "I was wrong," Kane said finally, his voice carrying none of its usual certainty. "Not about the facts. Elise Hartman did work at that signals facility. She did decode messages. She probably did contribute to the intelligence that helped position German defenses at Normandy. Those facts remain facts." He paused, his hands flat on the table mirroring Wade's posture from his dark night hours earlier. "But I was wrong about what those facts mean. Wrong about who she is now versus who she was then. Wrong about whether people can change and whether mercy is weakness or strength. I watched her save Morrison's life today. Watched her risk nothing and gain nothing from it except the knowledge that she helped someone who needed help. That's not the action of someone still fighting the war. That's the action of someone trying to become something better." Wade met his eyes, seeing his own struggle reflected there. She still might have contributed to Billy's death. We'll never know for sure. I have to live with that uncertainty. Have to choose mercy while carrying the possibility that I'm showing kindness to someone who hurt me in ways I can't even fully comprehend. "I know," Kane said quietly. "And that choice, that's the hardest thing a man can do. Easier to hate, easier to seek revenge, easier to turn grief into a weapon. But harder doesn't mean wrong." He pulled out the report he had been compiling, the one documenting every instance of fraternization and deviation from protocol, the one he had planned to submit with recommendations for Wade's reassignment and stricter prisoner management procedures. He held it for a moment, then slowly tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the table like autumn leaves. "I came here believing mercy was weakness, believing kindness to enemy prisoners was betraying our own dead. But I watched Morrison nearly die today, and I watched German prisoners save him without hesitation. And I realized that maybe the strongest thing we can do is choose to be better than what war made us. Maybe that's how we actually honor the dead. Not by becoming like them, but by becoming what they died hoping we could be." 3 days later, Colonel Garrett called a meeting of all 23 German prisoners. They assembled in the mess hall, confused and wary, wondering what new development awaited them. Wade stood near the front, his expression neutral, but his eyes finding Elise's across the room and holding for just a moment. "Ladies," the colonel began speaking through Luis, who translated into German. "The Red Cross has finalized arrangements for your repatriation to Germany. Ships will be available starting in August. You will be processed through and returned to occupation zones where you can attempt to reconnect with your families and begin rebuilding your lives." A ripple of mixed emotions passed through the women. Relief, fear, grief. The complicated feelings of people being told they could go home when home no longer existed in any recognizable form. However, the colonel continued, there is another option available to those who wish to pursue it. America needs workers. We need people willing to help with the massive task of rebuilding not just here, but around the world. The government has created a program allowing certain prisoners of war to apply for work visas and eventually permanent residency if they choose. He paused, letting Luis translate, letting the weight of those words settle over the assembled women. "You are not required to stay. No one will think less of you for choosing to return home. But if you wish to remain in America to build new lives here, that path is open to you. You would need to find employment, demonstrate good character, learn English. But it's possible. The choice is yours." The room erupted in whispered conversations. German voices rising and falling in waves of shock and speculation and desperate hope, mixed with equally desperate loyalty to everything they had lost. Elise sat frozen, her mother's letter burning in her pocket. "Your father and I would understand if you chose to stay. Home is where you build it, not always where you were born. Over the next 2 weeks, the women made their choices. 15 decided to return to Germany despite the uncertainty awaiting them there. They had families to find, children to reunite with elderly parents who needed care. They were German and would remain German, building new lives from the ruins of the old. But 8 women chose to stay. 8 women who had no one waiting for them, or whose families had explicitly told them to find better lives elsewhere, or who simply could not face returning to the devastation and judgment that awaited defeated Germany. 8 women who believed America offered something worth the cost of leaving everything they had known behind. Elise was among them. The decision had not been easy. She spent days agonizing over it, writing letters to her parents that she rewrote a dozen times before finally sending one that tried to explain the unexplainable. How Texas felt like a second chance. How Martha Crawford's kindness had shown her a different way of being in the world. How Klaus would have wanted her to live, really live, not just survive, in the ruins of what had been. Her parents' reply came faster than expected. Her father's shaky handwriting filling the page with words that gave her permission to choose herself over duty to the past. "We are proud of you," he wrote. "You survived. You changed. You chose life. That is all anyone can ask." On the day the 15 departing women left Camp Swift, tears flowed freely on both sides. German women who were leaving, embracing, and German women who were staying, both groups grieving the severing of connections forged in captivity. American guards shaking hands with prisoners they had grown to know as individuals rather than enemies. Martha Crawford hugging each departing woman and pressing a recipe card into their hands, her handwriting detailing the fried chicken instructions that had started everything. Ingrid Vogel was among those leaving. She approached Elise with an expression that held anger and grief in something that might have been envy or might have been pity. "I hope you find what you're looking for here. I hope it's worth the cost of forgetting where you came from." Elise met her eyes steadily, refusing to look away. "I'm not forgetting. I'm just choosing to believe that where I came from doesn't have to define where I'm going. That people can change, that I can become something other than what the war made me. I hope you find peace, Ingrid. I hope Germany gives you what you need to heal." They embraced briefly, 2 women who had shared captivity, if not friendship, then separated with the finality of people who knew they would likely never see each other again. The truck pulled away, taking 15 women toward an uncertain future in a devastated homeland. 8 remained facing an equally uncertain future in a foreign land. Austin, Texas, spring 1970. Elise Hartman. Crawford stood in the kitchen of Martha's kitchen, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, watching the lunch rush with the satisfaction of someone who had built something meaningful from ashes and grief and impossible choices. 25 years had passed since that summer at Camp Swift. 25 years since she had chosen to stay. 25 years of hard work and learning English and navigating the complicated process of becoming American while remaining German in all the ways that mattered. She had married Wade Crawford in 1948, a quiet ceremony at the Bastrop Baptist Church with Martha crying happy tears in the front pew. It had taken 3 years to get to that point. 3 years of carefully rebuilt trust, of Wade working through his grief and anger, of both of them learning to be more than what the war had made them. Their marriage was not perfect. Wade still had nightmares about Billy. Elise still grieved Klaus. They both carried scars that would never fully heal. But they had built something real from the ruins. Something that honored the dead by choosing life. Something that proved people could be better than their worst moments if they worked at it hard enough and long enough and with enough grace. Martha had lived to see her granddaughter born in 1951. Little Martha, named for the woman who had taught Elise that kindness could be stronger than hatred, that mercy could be braver than revenge, that fried chicken could save lives if prepared with the right intentions. The original Martha had passed peacefully in 1962. Her last words a reminder to keep the recipe alive. Keep teaching it, keep using it as a bridge between enemies who could become family. The restaurant had opened in 1963, funded by savings from years of Wade working the ranch, and Elise working wherever she could find employment, willing to hire a former German prisoner. They had started small, just a few tables serving Martha's fried chicken to skeptical customers who slowly became regulars as word spread about the quality and the story behind it. Now it was an Austin institution. People came for the chicken, but stayed for the story. The photographs on the wall told that story better than words ever could. 23 German women and 12 American soldiers, arms around each other smiling. Enemies who became family. Prisoners who became citizens. Elise moved through the lunch rush with practiced efficiency, greeting regular customers, checking on new ones, making sure the kitchen maintained Martha's standards. At a corner table sat an older man reading a newspaper, his graying hair and weathered features familiar. Danny Morrison, now 50 years old, who came in every Thursday for lunch and always ordered the fried chicken special. He had never forgotten that July day in 1945 when Elise and Clara had saved his life, had kept in touch over the years, had brought his wife and children to meet the woman who had given him a future when heat stroke could have ended it, had become family in the way people do when they share moments that change everything. Near the kitchen window, Wade helped with serving during the rush, his movements slower now at 67 but still capable. Their eyes met across the dining room, and he smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in ways it hadn't been able to for years after Billy's death. They had made a good life. Not a perfect life, but a good one that honored the dead by living well. The bell above the door chimed, and Elise looked up to see an elderly woman enter, leaning heavily on a cane. The woman was thin, her gray hair cut short, her face lined with years of hardship visible in every wrinkle. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, moving over the restaurant with an expression that held recognition and something else. Their eyes met across the room, and Elise felt her breath catch. She knew that face, knew those eyes, hadn't seen them in 25 years, but would have recognized them anywhere. Ingrid. She crossed the room quickly, her voice catching on the name. Ingrid Vogel. The woman smiled, and suddenly Elise could see the angry 21-year-old beneath the layers of age and experience. Elise Hartman. Or should I say Elise Crawford now? I read about your restaurant in a magazine. About the German woman who married an American guard and built a business from her mother-in-law's fried chicken recipe. I had to come see if it was true, if you really did it, if you really built something from all that awfulness. They embraced two old women who had been young prisoners together, who had made different choices and lived different lives, but shared a history that no one else could fully understand. When they pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes. Did you find what you were looking for? Elise asked. In Germany. Ingrid's smile was sad but genuine. I found rubble and grief and years of rebuilding that nearly broke me. But I also found purpose. I became a teacher. Taught children about the cost of hatred and the value of questioning authority and the importance of choosing what's right over what's easy. It was hard. God, it was hard. But it was mine. She looked around the restaurant, taking in the photographs, the full tables, the evidence of a life well lived. And did you find what you were looking for here? Elise thought about the question, about Wade and little Martha and the restaurant that fed hundreds of people every week. About Danny Morrison and his Thursday lunches. About the customers who came back again and again, not just for the food, but for the story it represented. About choosing mercy when revenge would have been easier. About building something good from the ruins of something terrible. I found a second chance, she said finally. I found proof that people can change if they're willing to do the work. I found family in the last place I expected. And I found that fried chicken, when prepared with the right intentions, can save more than just lives. It can save souls. They sat together at a corner table, two old women sharing a meal and swapping stories about the 25 years since they had last seen each other. The lunch rush flowed around them, servers bringing plates of golden fried chicken prepared exactly the way Martha Crawford had taught them all those years ago. The same recipe, the same care, the same belief that food prepared with love could bridge divides and heal wounds and transform enemies into family. Outside, Austin traffic hummed past. Inside, the smell of fried chicken filled the air, with the aroma of redemption served on chipped white plates. And on the wall, that faded photograph bore witness to a summer in 1945 when 23 German women and 12 American soldiers discovered that mercy tasted like buttermilk, fried chicken, and forgiveness was a choice you made every day, one meal at a time until it became not just a choice, but a way of being in the world.